Hi, everybody, and good morning. Thanks very much for joining. I'll start with the land acknowledgement and then kind of go from there. The University of Calgary is situated on land northwest of where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, a site traditionally known as Mohkinstsis, to the Blackfoot, Wichita and Stony Dakota, and Gutsitsits and Tusina. On this land, in this place, we strive to learn together, walk together, and grow together in a good way. As Sasha mentioned, I'm the Associate Dean Research here. Technically, I'm on sabbatical right now, so I'm in the best state of being Associate Dean Research at the moment, which is kind of not. I really do appreciate the efforts of Sasha and everyone in the room around this as an issue. As we reimagine housing in cities, we're also reimagining the way that we do post-secondary education. So whether that's being embedded in downtown or whether it's trying to address transdisciplinary themes across the university through our research and then down through our curriculum, these kinds of issues are incredibly important. The idea of housing affordability especially, and the way that we address housing at large in terms of the kinds of challenges that intersect with housing is really important to the sustainability of cities. I would also say that it's not just meeting to discuss the issues, and it's also not just imagining and visioning what these things could be, but it's also really important that it translates into meaningful actions and meaningful change in the environment. And I know that housing has been a very challenging and in many ways unsolvable, historically unsolvable kind of condition. And I would posit that maybe it's not so much about solutions, but just about being able to make positive change. And I know, from the past event and then carrying forward into this, there's a lot of people in the room that are actually doing things to improve the situation and address the challenge, not just in Calgary, but nationally and even globally. So these are things that the faculty in the university is committed to. I see Victoria over there in the back. She is one of my new academic co-leads across the university, looking at cities and societies, which this is certainly an important part of. So again, thank you very much for joining, and we look forward to this being one of many, many more events and conversations and actions toward improving the future that we're taking on at the university and the faculty. So back to you, Sasha.
Thank you. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Somerville, who is an associate professor and holder of the Real Estate Foundation Professorship in Real Estate Finance at the Sauder School of Business, University of British Columbia. His academic research includes work on housing market policies, housing supply, mortgage and real estate finance, and housing affordability. He has worked with all levels of Canadian government on the effects of immigration, capital flows, government policies on housing affordability and housing supply. Dr. Somerville received his PhD in economics from Harvard University and a BA in economics and East Asian studies from the Hebrew University. So without further ado, Professor Somerville.
Right, so I want to thank Sasha very much for inviting me and including me in this event. I think it's especially interesting when you get in those spaces where economists are talking with non-economists, because the way we approach these things and think about these issues is very, very different. Although most of the people in my field don't think they have anything to learn from anybody else, I would like to think I've gotten to the point in my life where I actually realize I have a whole bunch to learn from other people. And so I very much appreciate the opportunity. We do need to hear me.
Yeah, they can't hear you at the back.
It's the first time in my life somebody couldn't hear me. Sorry, so thank you very much. Let me also highlight that I cannot walk out the door without making a typo. And so even though I, in theory, proofread these slides, I went through them again just a minute ago and discovered a variety of grammatical mistakes for which I take full responsibility. So there we go. So what I wanted to talk about within the context of thinking about work that I was involved with in predicting the effects of the BC government's multiplex and transit-oriented area blanket rezoning policies, rather than focus on sort of what numbers we came out of, because as you'll see, those numbers are a function of a bunch of assumptions anyhow. Think a little bit, talk a little bit about sort of how we got there, and that's how that reflects sort of how economists sort of do this process, right? I managed to do this without any equations in here, but I do have some funky Latin words anyhow, and we'll get to those. And so the idea here is talk a little bit about the framework, so sort of theoretically, what's our framework for thinking about this? So talk a little bit theoretically, and that involves putting up some pictures. Hi, Patrick. So a few pictures. Then talk about sort of how we translate that into an empirical model where we try to estimate things. And when we use the term model, it's not these beautiful things that you guys have out here. It's like equations and running things through code, right? So I like coming through here and seeing things that are actually sort of beautiful and inspiring in ways that my work isn't quite that much. Then I want to talk a little bit about, and this probably will be done as part of running through the model, about the type of assumptions that we had to make and where that could lead to different types of results. So give you guys a sense of sort of the fragility of this process. And then sort of end up a little bit about thinking a little bit about how we might insert affordable housing into this, because this is very much a market exercise. What we went through here is sort of, okay, let's think about a housing market, let's think about input markets, and sort of play that out and run that out without thinking sort of formally about inclusionary zoning policies or sort of what new construction means to the stock and availability of lower priced housing, right? And I think those are fundamentally somewhat different conversations. They're related, but they're different, right? And when you talk about, well, house prices are 15% lower than they would be otherwise, that's an average, and that average can hide sort of real differences of the rents and prices that sort of different sectors of the population and different social demographic groups can face. Okay, so let's start a little bit with sort of where economists are coming from and what they believe, because what economists believe tend to be very different than what normal people believe. And whether or not that's because we're completely wrong or not, we'll leave that aside. So the basic point is that most economists would feel make a very strong case or sort of belief that land use regulation in general has negative effects on housing market outcomes. Right? So from the perspective, economists come from a perspective where we tend to believe that markets are the best way to allocate scarce goods. It's not that they're not without their faults and not issues and all kinds of problems, but in general that markets are a better way to allocate that. And when you start restricting and constraining markets, that leads to more negative outcomes than you would have otherwise. And so in the context of housing markets, the existence of land use regulation is going to mean that we have less housing than we would otherwise, and that the price on average, rents on average, are higher than they would be otherwise, right? And that's sort of a basic starting point. We also tend to very much worship at the term efficiency. And so when economists use the term efficiency, that's a belief about how resources are allocated, which is what is the way to achieve a goal at sort of the lowest cost. Now, that does not mean that is the only good in society, right? And so, I mean, if you were to fault my field, it's sort of worshiping efficiency at the expense of any types of other goals that society might have, right? And so when I say efficiency, I want it understood here not as a determinant of this is the goal that we should move to, so much as well, if you were trying to achieve an outcome at the lowest cost, this sort of would be the way to approve it. So that from the economist's perspective then, if you were interested in improving housing affordability, you would want to enable the supply response, the market supply response, as much as possible. So you'd have sort of a supply side response. And then if you were then concerned about people for whom the market essentially was not going to deliver housing that they could afford, provide those people with income, with cash, and let them then decide what to do with it, right? And so cash transfers to lower income people and the market to build housing would be sort of the economist's notion of an efficient approach. And things that would be considered inefficient would be inclusionary zoning, rent control is kind of the zombie apocalypse for most economists, and public housing would be considered an inferior, or social housing, an inferior approach to a cash transfer. Now that does come with a caveat that has to do with the ability of the market to build housing. Right? If the market cannot build housing, and if you have a low vacancy rate, giving people cash is just a transfer to landlords. So in order for the cash mechanism to work, there have to be sort of enough housing available, i.e. you can't have a 0.5 vacancy rate, and there has to be the ability to construct new housing quickly and easily. Otherwise, all it does is become a transfer to landlords and owners, and not necessarily improve people's outcomes. So that's sort of where economists are coming from. Okay, now you guys think that we are these people, right? Except for Patrick, who thinks we're Jar Jar Binks. So, you know, whether or not we're evil and have a mind, or whether we're just idiots, would be sort of the two ways. But I only wanted to do one picture. So, but I thought I would point out that you don't think we're this smart. You think we're more Jar Jar Binks. Of course, this is how we see ourselves, right? And so, you know, it's like it's all kind of relative here. So I'm going to sort of approach it from this approach, but recognize that I actually may be this person, right? And we'll sort of work it from there. So let's think about a theory of upzoning, right? So we're going to sort of think theoretically about upzoning and where that would lead. We're going to start from the presumption that existing zoning is constraining supply. Because existing zoning is not constraining supply, then upzoning doesn't do anything, right? So it has to start from a place where if you remove the current sets of zoning, we'd either get more density or taller buildings or more buildings or larger units or whatever. They would sort of, what we would see would be different than what we're observing under zoning, right? So essentially that zoning is constraining the market. And therefore, relaxing that constraint means over time, you'd be in a situation that at any level of house prices, you would have more housing. Right? That would be sort of the natural theoretical outcome of that. And that possibly, and then this is sort of an issue about how you think about this, and I'm going to come back to this, possibly we would make housing supply what's known as more elastic. So elasticity is a really, really important concept in economics. I'm going to assume that no one here took an economics course, even though that's not necessarily the case. And so what we mean by elasticity, or supply elasticity, is what is the change in the quantity of housing that's built for a given percentage change in price, right? So it's essentially how responsive is the supply mechanism to the price signal. So if you imagine a world where we have the housing we have and you can't change it at all and you can't build anything, we would refer to that as an inelastic supply because it's perfectly vertical. Demand could double. We don't change the number of housing units. So the other end of that would be a market where you can sort of basically snap your fingers and instantly, costlessly build as much supply as you want, and therefore we'd call that a perfectly elastic supply. Right? And so these are two factor areas where we think that zoning is constraining. It's constraining sort of how much we have housing, period, right? Sort of overall sort of supply constraints. So at any price level, we should have more housing. But that the zoning process, we would also believe affects the ability to respond quickly or respond at all to price signals, right? And so therefore, if you have upzoning, all else being equal, and that's sort of the Latin here, right? All else being equal, we would serve more construction. We would observe prices that are lower than they would be otherwise. Doesn't mean that they're lower, it's just lower than they would be otherwise. And you would see a faster response to demand shocks. So if you let in 1 million people into the country, right? If you have less regulation, you should, as the market responds, end up at a situation where there's more housing and rents and prices are lower than they would be otherwise. So here's the little pictures, right? Picture number one, this is sort of just to remind the story on elasticity. So, right, this is an inelastic supply, right? And this is an elastic supply, i.e. here, it takes a large change in prices to get the market, right, to increase supply. And here, for a relatively small change in prices, you can get a lot of supply. And that elasticity is a function of sort of labor supply, the regulatory process, capital markets, land availability, technology. A lot of sort of things go into that. It's not just a regulatory story. But it's going to be important if we think, because it tells us for a given demand shock, how much of that is a price increase versus how much of that is a quantity increase, right? And so if you believe that even with upzoning, right, we're in this kind of market, right, you're not going to get the same kind of effect that you would if you thought we were in this kind of market. Point number two, right, is either way, right, if you think we're elastic or we're inelastic, to the extent that upzoning means that at any price level, right, we have more supply, right, then sort of uniformly, the market outcome under upzoning is more housing and lower prices than it would be otherwise. And that's, I guess most of you are over here. And that's going to be sort of more the case with an elastic supply, right? With a more elastic supply, we get sort of a larger quantity effect relative to the price effect. Sort of the next point is that if you, either way, right, either with a shift to supply or with elastic supply, if you get a large demand shock, you will get higher prices. So you can't just look at what happened to prices and then that make your determination if something is good or not, right? Because no matter what your supply function, whether you're shifting it or what, if you get a large enough demand increase, you're going to have higher prices than you would otherwise. And the only way, right, that you can get sort of more supply to have higher prices is essentially a situation where the demand curve is upward sloping, i.e. the higher the prices, the more people want. This seems to be a very hard thing to find in nature, right? Because in general, people buy at least all the things that economists have studied, that people tend to buy less of something when the price goes up. My way of thinking about upzoning and house prices and affordability is a water pressure metaphor, right? So rather than sort of doing this, right, the simple way to think about it is water pressure, where demand is the pressure we have in the system. Right? The demand for housing is sort of the pressure that we have in the system, and the supply response is sort of the size of the hole that pressure is going to flow through. Right? That's kind of the simple way to think about that, right? So if you only are going to let people build housing in certain locations, then you're going to get tremendous pressure in those places. And so if you think about sort of the price pressure is very, very intense in those locations, i.e. if there's only one place that you can build housing and there's a lot of demand for housing, then the price at that point gets pushed up a lot, as opposed to sort of spreading that out more evenly by having it sort of be in a lot of places. right? So the way you want to think about that is, if in Calgary we only allow new higher density housing to be built in the East Village and Beltline, right? Then you're going to get more pressure on prices, particularly land prices in those areas, right? Than if you basically say, you know what, we can build housing everywhere. Okay, so let's move to the empirical way to now sort of think about, okay, so if we do upzoning, what happens? The empirical model, and this applies both to doing sort of missing middle, multiplex upzoning, and to doing the transit-oriented areas, right? So the basic model applies whether or not you're looking at those aspects of policy that are sort of blanket rezoning, allowing any, on a single-family lot, allowing anywhere from 3 to 6 units, whether or not it's sort of a missing middle, medium density, sort of 4-story program, or whether or not you're allowing more, substantially more intense development around transit nodes in the sort of transit-oriented areas, right? That the basic sort of modeling approach is to sort of figure out what's the price that you would get per unit, right, for these new units. Back out a land residual for redevelopment. So essentially say, okay, if this is the revenue that we're going to get, right? We're going to, actually, I'll get to this in a second. Back out the land residual for redevelopment, right? From that, identify areas where redevelopment is profitable, right? Which is identical to a positive land lift for those of you who think about it in that areas. Then estimate the ability of the industry to actually execute that. Given that execution, what does that do to price levels? And then we sort of readjust the model, because as that affects price levels, that sort of comes back in, right? So it's kind of an iterative type process. So estimating prices. At some level, this is a very simple sort of statistical process. We have, people have been doing price estimation for housing for a long time. And the challenge here is that, to a great extent, we're trying to estimate the prices of higher density units, condos and townhouses, in places where those don't exist, right? So we have a modeling framework that lets us predict prices based on the units that we have, but how do you do that if you don't have any of those kinds of inputs? And so what you essentially end up doing is estimating these prices based on the existing stock and the existing locations, and then distributing those over geography based on the way single house prices vary, right? So if there's a single house, there's an area that only has single house prices. The single houses there are 25% higher than they are in an area where they're condos. Then you would essentially say, okay, well, let's take that condo price and essentially say it's going to be 25% higher as well, right? So it's essentially taking and doing this sort of geographic sort of smoothing based on the single-family house prices. And so therefore, if these prices actually vary differently across neighborhoods, right, in ways that you don't know about, you could get some kind of bias, right? And so one of the things that you worry about is this process suggests very, very high condo and townhouse prices in very, very high-priced single-family neighborhoods. It's not necessarily clear that people, would pay those prices for condos and townhouses there relative to the price they'd pay for a single-family house in a less desirable neighborhood, right? And so, that is, one concern with this method. And when you look at that, right, this is exactly what comes out, right? So sort of think about this as being the place where house prices are highest, right? So you're in the middle of English Bay. Is that English Bay, Patrick? I don't know my geography. Yeah, if you're in the middle of if you manage to have a house in the English Bay, that would kind of be the highest priced area, right? This sort of red stuff is highest priced, and out here it's sort of lower priced. If we did a heat map of single house prices, it'd look like this too, right? And so the condo prices, the multiplex unit prices here essentially really map on to the distribution of single family house prices, right? And that might be problematic. So given these prices, though, we calculate a land residual, which is essentially, given these prices, what would a developer be willing to pay for land that would let them do those kinds of developments, right? And so it's essentially like calculating a land lift. There are issues in translating this into numbers, right? Number one, what is the actual built form? When you say a 4-unit multiplex, that can look a lot of different ways. It can be sort of stacked like condos. Maybe you sort of do it more like townhouses. And that's not something that we feel very sort of skilled at doing. We sort of made some assumptions, but that there's an assumption there. There's an assumption about what's the appropriate construction cost and quality to apply. There's an assumption about what's the profit rate that developers are using in their analysis. And you might believe that this is sensitive to the perceptions, you should believe that this is sensitive to the perceptions of risk, right? So for instance, in general, people who build single-family housing enter in with a lower sort of expected profit rate than people who are doing, multi-story condo towers, because of the sort of the nature, the risks are very different. Finally, the thing that I worry about a lot is sort of parking and how that determines outcomes, right? So, it's one thing, I gave this assignment to students, and the number of students who built, fourplexes that were condo fourplexes in high-priced areas with no parking was astounding. Because the notion that someone was going to pay $2 million for one of these units and then do street parking seemed to me a little problematic, given what I know about North Americans. Now, we participated in the NAIOP competition, which was in Calgary this year, with a site near a Green Line station, right? And I had to try to convince my students that just because you were near a station didn't mean people weren't going to have cars, right? Maybe I'm wrong on that, but in my experience, if people have cars in Manhattan, people are going to have cars in North America. The outcome of this is what we refer to as a development option. You can think about as land lift, which is essentially if you take sort of revenues and subtract out profits and the costs of doing that, right, you get a number, right? If that number is higher than the price of single-family housing at that location, then we say it's profitable to develop, i.e. it's more profitable to do a multiplex, right, you can get than it is to keep the single-family housing. And so when we map this, we get something that looks, again, remarkably like the distribution of house prices, that the redevelopment option is more profitable on the west side, and interestingly enough, also quite profitable in Burnaby, and less sort of profitable in outer areas. So in this model, essentially any place that's sort of in the yellow to red, you would get redevelopment as multiplexes, and places that are sort of in the blue-purple, you wouldn't, right? Because in a place here, right, the price a developer can pay for land is less than the price that the house can transact for single-family housing. Now, some of these things are interesting. That part of this is that Burnaby has larger lots, and therefore you can do sort of larger multiplexes than you can on the other side of Boundary Road. There's sort of interesting little quirks there. A little comment on land prices for price per buildable. Are you here? Is he here?
Oh,
He's coming electronically. Okay. So Professor Green, or Dr. Greenway McGreevy has done a lot of work on the changes in Auckland and their mass rezoning and how that's played out in terms of starts, prices, and one of the things that I wanted to highlight here is that there's a difference between what happens to the price of land per square meter of land versus what happens to the price of land as an input, right, a price per buildable, as an input into the production process. And so if you get rezoning and you give people more things that they can do with the land, not surprising, land prices should be rising, right? But the key issue here from an economic standpoint is what's happening to the land input into the production process. And there, what you see is that the land price per buildable, right, for the higher density stuff in Auckland falls relative to the single family input, when the reverse is true if you just look at the price of land. And so that difference between the price of land versus land as per unit of square meter of housing is a really important difference. Okay, so we did this exercise and we found out that that given sort of our model of house prices and our assumptions and our inputs on the construction process, that there's a whole bunch of areas where it would be profitable, you know, a developer could buy a single family house at a single family house price and profitably redevelop it, right? That's kind of the exercise. How does that actually translate, right? How much is actually going to get built? Because we've got like some big issues here. Number one, there's land assembly issues, particularly for if you want to do sort of higher density. There's the ability of the industry to execute this, right? There's, you know, just like, do we have people who can actually build this stuff? And there's sort of what I would call regulatory snafus, which can be, you know, there's lots of different ways other than, you know, zoning, right, to make something difficult to do, right, and the extent to which that plays out. There's also a question of where this gets built. Right? The model says it's most profitable at certain locations, and sort of all else being equal, that would be our expectation. But reality sort of tells some slightly different stories on that. And then there's also incorporating what else is going to be happening, right? Well, if we increase construction, there's more demand for labor supply, there's more demand for materials, that's going to increase construction costs. And so we have to sort of think about this feedback loop on construction costs. We also have to think about sort of what's going on in the background on sort of demographic pressures. And I probably should have a third point here. We should also think about the land input, right? Because as we go out and start to buy lots of single family lots to build higher stuff, there are fewer single family lots, and therefore their price should be going up, right? And so we worry about that feedback loop. This is a map, and I don't know how you can see these dots. This is from 2017. It's from a paper that I did on Vancouver laneways or accessory dwelling unit take-up. And the key thing I want to highlight here, the yellow line is kind of dividing the east side of Vancouver versus the west side of Vancouver, right? And house prices here are about twice as high as they are here, you know, plus or minus approximately. Based on a sort of simple, sort of like naive model, you would expect most of the laneways to be over here, right? Because the laneways, you're just building more space on the land. You don't have to buy more land to do it. Construction costs should be the same in these places, right? It's the same market. There shouldn't be a difference in construction costs. Rents are going to be higher over here. Therefore, it should be more profitable to get laneways here. So we should see a whole bunch of laneways here, right, relative to here. And we actually see the reverse. Right? And so that does raise the point that just because something is profitable, sort of in a naive modeling standpoint, may not necessarily mean that it plays out. One way to think about this is it's highly profitable to build a multiplex here, which is four 1,200 square foot condo units, and let's say they're selling at $2 million, which is not affordable. But it's more affordable than the house, which is $4 million, right? So affordability here is relative. That person buying that house may be making the choice, wait a minute, I can get the $2 million condo here, or I can buy a single family house over here. And so a lot depends in terms of the uptake, not necessarily just on the price points, but on the sort of substitution or the what we call the elasticity of substitution between different types of housing in different locations. Right? And so, you know, if you were to ask me, my prediction would be we get a whole bunch more multiplexes here, even though they're, quote, less profitable than we do here, just because of the type of trade-off that people are making and who's buying what at a particular price point. That's not something that we modeled here. It's something that we were concerned about. So the way we modeled it was, if we think about the multiplexes, is that we essentially assumed that there was no increase, like that people weren't going in and buying up housing and increasing the rate of sales. We assumed that housing continues to sell or turn over at the regular rate. People own single family houses, they sell it when they're ready to move, right? That there weren't people going around offering huge premiums. Given that a house sells, what's the probability that it redevelops? And we essentially had a distribution where places where the redevelopment option was essentially marginal, only about 10% of the transactions redevelop. But places where it was highly profitable, 90% do. And again, I think that's something that one might call into question, that it actually should be higher here and lower here. But we didn't have good grounds to make that distinction on. let me also point out, this is really sensitive to what's going on in the background. So we've got 3 examples in BC of sort of missing middle policies that were enacted at the municipal level. Kelowna was phenomenally successful, and it was an abject failure in Coquitlam and Victoria. When we look at those things, we see a very, very different kind of regulatory environment. Victoria made it really difficult to do this. Kelowna basically went in, simplified it, worked with developers and architects to identify built forms that essentially would be fast-tracked on the DP and the BP, and had a much more successful outcome. And this is probably really hard to see. But these are the areas that had the multiplex zoning in Calgary, in Kelowna, and the gray are units that did not turn over, right? So you didn't get this sort of mass of people coming in and buying up units. Units that transacted, what did we end up seeing? And so you see this sort of color distribution here. And the key thing to note is not everything redeveloped, right? The redevelopment didn't massively occur. But if we look at this on a timeline, right, you sort of see that sort of a certain percentage of the units in these areas are redeveloping as single-family housing, a little bit of duplex. But once we get the policy, you're still getting the single-family stuff, but you're getting a whole bunch more of the fourplex, right? And you get this sort of this huge ramp up. Now, if you looked at Victoria and Coquitlam, it'd be just like this. You actually don't get anything, which we suspect is very much sensitive to the sort of regulatory process and framework. So, other process issues that we have to worry about are will developers choose to do this, right? So because it's an option, will they do it? Do we think they can build it? Will banks finance it? And one of the things we don't talk about is, that we have a fairly concentrated financial system here, and the banks, which are the lowest cost of funds, are really, really conservative. And so the ability to sort of do stuff that hasn't been done yet, it's hard to get banks to finance that. And obviously, what's the effect of this on existing detached units? I'm going to go through a few summary slides here of what we found. This is looking at the turnover of single-family properties, right? That turn over, and sort of what percentage get redeveloped as what. And the key thing I want you to notice here, and this is by metro area and census agglomerations, is that the action here is really in the multiplex. That if you look at sort of the number of sites that things happen at, relatively few in the TOA, the really high density stuff, and a whole lot more at the missing middle, right? That there's sort of a lot more sort of ground in terms of where things happen in terms of geography for the missing middle. If we look at the overall increase in the dwelling stock, because the TOA stuff and the high density is just higher density, you do get more stuff there. But still, overwhelmingly, the increase in the stock is happening out of the multiplexes. That the really important gains here are out of the multiplexes, not out of the transit-oriented development. And the only place you really get that transit-oriented development is in the Vancouver metro area. Once you get out of the Vancouver metro, you don't really see any of that. A few comments on the TOA, though. Number one is that for a lot of places, things that were identified for the higher density transit-oriented area development, they already have higher density designations under OCPs. So they're already designated that. That's number one. Number two is the province is not requiring rezoning to higher density. They're just saying that you can't reject an application, right, based on certain height and density parameters, which opens up a whole bunch of ways to sort of mess with that process other than just height and FSR in terms of costs and roadblocks. Rental versus strata. This is a hard one to work out. Because number one, what you observe in reality depends on a bunch of regulatory stuff, right? So if I'm doubling the allowed density for rental versus strata, that's changing the math calculation. Right now, government supported financing from CMHC makes rental, much more attractive than strata because the financing costs are dramatically lower, dramatically lower. And so, we sort of stayed away from that and, ignored any inclusionary zoning, ignored any beneficial financial. The other issue is that if you're trying to do TOA with their single family areas, you're going to have to do land assembly. Right? In order to have a lot that's large enough for this sort of just to make sense from a design standpoint, you're going to have to assemble, and that creates a lot of challenges around timing and costs. If we look on the sort of OCP side, this is the Broadway plan versus the transit-oriented areas. And the thing to notice here is is that purple? I'm very bad with colors. Like my wife teases me because I can't figure out. That's purple? You guys are supposed to be like the people who know all this artsy stuff, right? Like I would call it red, so like I kind of need some help here. Burgundy, thank you. You see? It's aubergine. You got it wrong. This is actually aubergine. The Broadway plan actually allows for a lot higher density, on this corridor in most places than the TOA directives from the province. It's only sort of in the orange and the light green where the province has sort of higher density targets. And that's not just in Vancouver. This is in Burnaby around the Metrotown area. And so, again, the sort of the aubergine are places where the existing planning allows for higher density, and so you're only looking at potential, quote, benefits, unquote, in essentially the orange and seafoam. I'm really trying to be part of the place here, right? Areas. So again, I think the point here is that the marginal effect of the TOA policy actually may be a lot smaller, and these places where it applies are all places where you have to deal with assembly issues, and from a developer standpoint, that just gets complicated. Because we didn't have the zoning benefits for rental, and because we didn't have the below cost, the sort of lower cost financing that's currently available under essentially with the National Housing Strategy, our model generates a lot more strata than it does rental, right? You could change these dynamics by using sort of the two, essentially some of the financing differences and some of the zoning differences. You could get these things to be different. So what are the overall effects? The overall effects, these are the sort of percentage change in the amount of housing that you get relative to what would have been the case, right? So everything here, the important thing is, what do you get relative to what you would have had otherwise? One thing to note here, and this is where the colors matter, is because we expect the supply response in terms of like getting construction workers in the industry to sort of ramp up relatively slowly, right? The first, 5 years, which are sort of the red yellows, that's a smaller percentage of the response than the sort of green, blues, blacks, which are the sort of years 6 to 11. Right? This stuff is backloaded because, one, it takes time to develop stuff, but also we just don't think the industry, right, tomorrow is going to say, oh, sure, we can build 3 times the number of units. That's number one. Number two, if you look again, and this gets back to the multiplex versus the TOAs, in part because the TOAs require assembly, in part because the net change from the TOAs is only the stuff where the TOA zoning kind of guidelines are higher than existing plans, the bulk of the increase in the housing is coming out of the multiplexes, right? The multiplexes is again where the biggest bang for the buck is, and even under the TOAs, right? It's not the 5 and the 4. It's actually sort of the mid-level TOA where you get the effect. Price effects, this is something where some combination of government ministries, government spokesmen, and the spokespeople and the media managed to make a hash of effects. So our whole notion here of an effect is what's the price effect relative to what would have happened otherwise, not the overall price effect, right? So it's a sort of an important thing to consider. So what the price, what happens depends on what you think is going on in the background. So Do we think that prices are going to be rising at 2% adjusting for inflation over the next 10 years? Or do we think they're going to be rising at 4%? And given those, what the error was essentially saying for multifamily units, so not housing overall, for multifamily units, what's the relative, what are we seeing relative to what we would have otherwise? And sort of across the board, except places where you don't get any construction, what you are seeing is that the prices are going to be lower. And in fact, for Kelowna, we actually get, declines in real prices over the 10-year period. Most places, prices are still rising. And if prices rise at 4% a year, then every base but Kelowna, a few places, Penticton probably, you're getting rising prices, but multifamily prices being, substantially lower in percentage terms than they would be otherwise. But what about single-family prices? Single-family prices, you've got sort of a mix of different things going on. So on the one hand, you've got downward pressure because all of a sudden there are sort of more options that are more affordable, right? If I want to live in what was a single-family neighborhood, now there might be townhouse options that are more affordable, or large condos that might be more affordable. So there's some degree of there's people at the margin who may substitute out of single-family housing into these alternatives that would lower the demand for single-family housing, right? So there's sort of that effect. We believe that that's going to be swamped by these other effects. In particular, sort of an upward pressure supply effect, which is if you're converting single-family lots into multiplex housing, right, and into sort of transit-oriented housing, you got a lot less single-family housing, right? We don't think the rich are like, oh, look, there's a condo. I want to live in that. We think the rich are going to rich, right? And there's nothing about human history that doesn't suggest to me that the people with enough money, will try to do whatever they can with that money, which means that the price of single-family housing, right, as you decrease the supply of single-family housing, right, the price of single-family housing is actually going to increase more than it would be otherwise. So in places where multiplexes happen, the price of single-family housing should go up, right? And then there's, that's just sort of a supply effect, and then there's sort of this land price effect, which is sort of the fact that developers, in order to develop, it's got to be more profitable to develop than own a single-family house, and that means outbidding single-family housing, and that sort of pushes up, right? So this is the effect because single-family lots are an input into the redevelopment process, and this is the effect because now you have less single-family housing. Our belief that this is going to dominate. And so the average effect on overall prices, right, is not quite this wonderful, right? Because you've got sort of the positive effects on affordability for this increased supply of multi-unit housing, right? But against that, you have what single-family housing is left becomes less affordable. And so that was my attempt to do what Sasha asked me to do, and I have no idea if I did that or not, but I think there were 3 or 4 words in your email that I covered here, so I'll focus on that successful part rather than the parts where I may have gone completely off track.